If you're in a difficult marriage, is neurology at play? I'm Dr. Carol, and thank you for joining me on this program. I hear from people all the time who are in a very, very difficult marriage. There's a lot of conflict or disconnection or sometimes even abuse. What role does biology, neurology in particular, play in this? I have an expert to help sort this out today. Dr. Stephanie Holmes is a psychologist. She also has a doctor's degree in education. She has been in practice for a number of years now, specializing in helping individuals who are struggling with neurodiversity and similar challenges, and in particular, marriages and relationships where at least one partner is what we are now calling neurodiverse, particularly autism or on the autism spectrum. I know some people personally who are walking through this kind of challenge, and I was so looking forward to this conversation. Dr. Holmes, I believe, presents what is a very thoughtful and balanced way to think about this. When we look at autism and the ways that plays out in relationships or similar kinds of things, understanding that that may be a factor doesn't excuse abuse. You will hear her say there is no excuse for abuse, regardless of the neurology. And understanding these factors helps relationships work better if this is at play. We are not assuming the outcome of the marriage in this conversation. You'll hear Dr. Holmes say that. So I was fascinated by this. In particular, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes into our conversation, Dr. Holmes really gets very specific about Christ-likeness and neurology and how we think about those things. All of us, regardless of the package we bring to following Jesus, are called to become more Christ-like. You'll hear us talk about that. So here's my conversation with Dr. Stephanie Holmes. Dr. Stephanie Holmes, it is great to have you on the program today. Thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here and be able to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for having me.
We are talking about something that is your sweet spot, and also, I understand, kind of personal to you, something that is not talked about a whole lot, but super, super important. And maybe you can just start with telling a bit of maybe your story and how you came to specialize in neurodiverse marriages.
All right. Well, I usually kind of start my story like once upon a time. I was a counselor in school working on my master's degree. And so the very first time I would even hear the word Asperger's syndrome was in what used to be called abnormal psychology. I don't know what they call it now, because I'm sure that's not the term that we use anymore. But in the 1990s, the DSM-4 was coming out. And it was in that diagnostic statistic manual, the word Asperger's and high functioning autism was being addressed. Now, all we did was run through that for about 5 minutes. And specifically, the professor said, you just need to know this for differential, for personality disorders. You'll never see anybody come into your office who's high functioning autism. These individuals don't marry, they isolate, but just know this for differential diagnosis. So I checked that into my brain and went on with life. Was recently married, then had a child. My child started doing some things that are a little quirky and eccentric, but my therapist's brain, I was an LPC at the time, said, oh, this is OCD. Look at how she lines things up. Look at how she orders things. Look at how she doesn't like transition. So my brain was kind of going OCD, anxiety, generalized anxiety. So through multiple things that would happen and acting out at school, as they call it, she would receive a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome in 2005, 2006. And really that begins our journey into autism, high functioning autism.
Yeah. So you and your family, your husband and your daughter have put out some wonderful resources. And I'm just going to say right here at the start, check the links, folks. If anything in our conversation today tweaks your interest, because Dr. Holmes and her family have some wonderful stuff out there to help. Where did it start to become an issue that you realized could impact marriages as much as it does?
So, just in working with my own daughter and trying to get her help when she was, a child, there just weren't very many clinicians, whether it be psychiatrists, psychologists, educators, nurses, doctors, that really understood high functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. But I wasn't really into that as a specialty yet. Like I was still living it. I was still just trying to get through it and sometimes just literally trying to keep my child alive and trying to get her through school. So at first it was just, as an LPC, you would have to go and get, specialty credits, continuing education. So just every time I needed continuing education, I was doing it on autism, driving all around the Southeast to be more educated, mainly specifically for my daughter.
Yeah.
So as she, my how I would kind of work through hers, like if she was in elementary school, about in fifth grade, I would go and start looking like, okay, what does this look like in middle school? And then in like seventh, eighth grade, what does this look like in high school? And then in high school, it's like, okay, what does this look like in adults? And so I think she was in 10th or 11th grade. And I went to a seminar on how to, what's life like for adults on the spectrum. Because this is kind of the first kind of cohort generation of kids kind of coming into adulthood, from the 1990s. She was born in 1990.
Hmm.
And so I was like, okay, I never really thought about adults on the spectrum. So as the speaker is going through adult autism, my face reacted so much that the speaker said, the lady in the second row has just figured out her spouse is on the spectrum. And it was like, oh my goodness, light bulbs going off because I had missed my own husband being on the spectrum. And for our story, we met when I was 10 and he was 11. So we've known each other since we were children. So like all of a sudden, like his life is flashing through my eyes and my mind. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. And I called him up to have lunch with me because this conference happened to be just one exit up from where we lived. And he was like, sure, I'll meet you for lunch. And I'm like, I gotta tell you something. I think you're on the autism spectrum. And he just kept eating. And he said, I've been telling you for years that Sydney and I are practically the same person and we think alike. I just don't react the way she does. And I was like, oh, okay.
Wow.
He's like, this is new news for you. This is not new news for me. So it was kind of that point, that moment of really just trying to help my daughter transition into adulthood, realizing we're possibly a neurodiverse marriage. And
Mm.
then, oh my goodness, that makes sense. And then the realization as a trained counselor, I was never taught anything about autism or neurodiversity, ADHD in marriage. I mean, it was
Yeah.
assumed people didn't marry. And so that really started me thinking to like, I need to be the resource that is not available that I wish I had, that I can't even go to because I can't find it. So how do I become the resource that I wish was available to me?
Yeah. Well, I personally know two couples that I believe are in this category, neurodiverse marriages. And I don't think it's nearly as uncommon as many people may have thought. And I know that's one of your passions, just to bring this to awareness. However, if somebody is listening and saying, "Well, how do I know? My marriage has been complicated or difficult, and what are some significant or pretty common clues that this may be a factor you're dealing with in your relationship?"
Great question. So I think first of all, since there was a 2019 JAMA study of 2.1 million people across 5 countries, that was a longitudinal study, which in research terms, that is a very strong study with 2.1 million people, 5 countries, and longitudinal. And they found an 80% heredity rate specifically for what used to be called Asperger's, high functioning autism, or autism level 1 without cognitive impairment, or what was formerly called mental retardation. So first of all, if it's in family, if there are nieces, nephews, grandchildren, children, people who have been getting the diagnosis of either autism or ADHD, which is
Yeah.
also a neurodivergency, you can start to think that maybe there are some people in the family. Also common in neurodivergent families might be learning processing issues, dyslexia, auditory processing, all those kind of things kind of fit the neurodivergent group, so to speak, the umbrella. So I think, first of all, if it's in your family, the likelihood that it is in your genes is there.
Mhm.
If you have a child or grandchild, possibly a parent or a grandparent is on the spectrum and was missed. my research showed that the average age of adults getting diagnosed is between the age of 40 and 49. So that's usually where marriages are in crisis. They've been at counseling for decades. Nothing seems to work. And so the average age, in fact, in my study, over 86% of 300 people who participated, the diagnosis came over the age of 30. And that higher cohort was 40 to 49. So I think genetics, we start looking at that. And maybe we're thinking about, people in our family who are maybe engineers or architects or a little different, a little isolated, extremely brilliant, but a little socially different or awkward. That's kind of a space to start. Where some spouses start, and I caution, is some people will go, get on Google and be like, why is my husband so selfish? And usually the first thing that will pop up is narcissism. And so while I do believe someone can be neurologically wired autistic and have a personality disorder such as narcissism, it is rare. It can happen. But sometimes wives will jump right on that narcissist thing, and then they'll start using that with their spouse. I just Googled, why our marriage is so hard, and you're a narcissist. And so before we start using really strong language, it would be really important to know the difference. Is this person really, truly narcissistic personality disorder? Or is it autism spectrum? Because there's some overlap, like what looks like selfishness could be self-referencing. What looks like gaslighting could be really, he doesn't remember you had that conversation yesterday. And so it feels the same as a spouse, sometimes to be married to a narcissist or married to someone on the spectrum, but the intention and the motivation of what's happening for that person is crucial for how you would move forward in counseling or coaching.
I am so glad you brought that up, Dr. Holmes. I, not long ago, had a conversation on our podcast about narcissistic and emotional abuse in marriage. So I'm glad you brought up that they can overlap and that there can be some similar emotional experiences for the spouse. And I just want to say, neurodiversity is no protection against sin. Certainly, we all have our sin nature, and Jesus invites all of us to go through transformation. But would you just talk a little bit more about how might somebody sort that out, especially for a spouse who feels like this has been such a complicated and lonely marriage? What's going on with their spouse? Can you help separate that a bit?
Yeah. So I really like the definitions of trauma from author Dr. James Wilder. And he separates trauma into trauma A and trauma B. Trauma A stands for absence, whereas trauma B stands for bad things. So trauma A is more, it's absence, it's abandonment, it's rejection, it's a spouse feeling isolated. My spouse isn't sharing the mental load. They don't cherish me. They don't see me. They don't communicate with me. Just like when you think of children who, if they're missing nutrition and care, they would be failure to thrive. The same thing can happen for adults. Our brains need connection. We were wired and made for relationships. So when our most important relationship is absent of these things, it is traumatic to the brain. The brain is starving for that relationship. And sometimes the person on the spectrum just simply does not need that much connection. They want more autonomy. So there's this balance of trying to seek autonomy, which may be important for the spectrum person, but relatedness, which is really important for the neurotypical or non-autistic person. And so a lot of my relationships, the wife would say maybe is more trauma A, but then there can be trauma B. So I don't know if you've if you're out there and you've ever seen a child on the spectrum melt down, where just they become so dysregulated and maybe they're throwing things or hitting things or self-harming or saying things that are really hurtful. It's just because it's coming from a non-filtered, it's not a temper tantrum. It's like their central nervous system and their amygdala are on fire. That doesn't stop when someone's an adult. So if someone is more prone to that meltdown or dysregulation, that's really scary to be with an adult person who is throwing things at you, yelling verbal abusive things at you, cursing at you, especially when they're Christian, because it's like, whoa, where did this come from? How are you saying these awful things and calling me those terrible names? And then there can also be the shutdown, which can be sometimes individuals on the spectrum can get so overwhelmed by the emotion and the presence of noise or even children, that they can do like an internal shutdown where they don't want to be around any sensory thing, and it can last for hours or days. And so the spouse is like, like my spouse hasn't spoken to me in 3 to 5 days. So there could be like this absence and just this pain of isolation or this dysregulation that can result, whether it's autism or not. If you verbally call someone a name, verbal abuse is verbal abuse, no matter what your neurology is. Emotional abuse is emotional abuse, no matter what your neurology is. And then in the Christian realm, there's this spiritual, religious abuse, especially if the man, specifically on the spectrum, uses scripture to demand sex or to demand, I don't have to listen to your opinion because I'm right and I'm the head. That, taken in a very black and white way, now adds spiritual and religious abuse. It's not as common for there to be domestic violence in these situations, but sometimes there is. So domestic violence is not as common. Sometimes it might be the woman who gets sick and tired of this, might be the first person to actually hit. And so it can become a very toxic cycle, because what's happening is most of all, the couple doesn't even know they're neurodiverse for many, 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 many years. And so they're in this cycle, this terrible cycle of not understanding each other. Either he's pulling away or exploding, and she's either kind of chasing him down to try to get some connection, or she becomes dysregulated too, constantly being in a dysregulated, and now has a trauma response. So that's kind of what's happening. And by the time they get to counseling, my research shows they've been through 5 to 7 counselors and invested over $10,000 in counseling before anyone's even brought up the term autism or neurodiversity.
Wow. Wow. You mentioned the impact on sex briefly. Many times on our podcast and our resources, we talk about sexuality and intimacy and all of that. Just another word, Dr. Holmes, about how does this play out in marriages around sexuality?
Okay, so this is kind of complex. So we'll do like the overview, but
Sure.
there's actually several different profiles of sensory, the sensory profile for a person who's on the spectrum. But I'll stick with like the 2 known ones. So that most people know. One is like the person who is like everything is 2. So we call that sensory aversive or overly sensitive. So to sight, sounds, touch. So that's one manifestation. But there's also sensory seeking, who seek and touch and like feel the need to connect through the world of touch. So if you're married to a person on the spectrum who is more sensory averse, the act of sex is a very overwhelming sensory experience, from smells to how body heat changes.
Yes.
And some people are super sensitive to that. The actual feeling, the touching of sex, the heat, the temperature change in the body, how intimate it is. The sounds, like kissing, can be really problematic for some people on the spectrum. So if you've got that individual, it may look like they are asexual, and some are, but not everybody. It could be finding some things to deal with some of the sensory issues to work with. Then you have the sensory seeker, and that might be someone who thinks they really have this really super high sex drive, but it really is they're sensory seeking. And so without really knowing and understanding, I really need to connect with my wife before we have sex. It's like, well, the rule in healthy Christian, teaching is 3 times a week if you're a healthy couple. So you kind of owe this to me, and I need this. And because that's an outlet, this person needs more sensory intake for it to even register. And sometimes what's happening is someone on the spectrum, especially men, sex can be an anxiety release. And so while they're calling it it's my release because they think it's like, just their sexual release, in that moment, there's, 5 or 10 minutes afterglow of no anxiety. So some men sadly will objectify their wives as an anxiety relief, wanting it every day or twice a day, and kind of seeing that that's their wife's responsibility because A, that's how I feel connected to her, and B, it has a secondary effect of relieving anxiety. So some women I've worked with had to have sex every day, even on their cycle. So there's kind of these different manifestations. And then a really difficult one is, we believe in, celibacy before marriage, right? Abstinence. And so some people don't know that they really aren't sexually attracted, or they don't have sexual feelings until after they're married. and now they're trying, to be intimate together. And sometimes the person on the spectrum has no interest in sexuality, and that becomes a problem as well. Now you're in a celibate marriage, and that's a whole different animal to
Yes.
deal with. But so it can be really different.
Yeah. I can imagine that there might be people listening who say, well, if my spouse is on the spectrum, do I just have to put up with being being hurt? I feel like I'm being hurt all the time. How do I handle this? What would you say to somebody who is really struggling with that?
Well, first of all, there's no excuse for abuse. So no matter what your neurology is, there's absolutely no excuse for abuse. The second thing is I find, especially Christian wives, have totally put all of their identity into their marriage and the outcome of their marriage. So the first thing that I say is we're going to put the outcome of the marriage to the side. We're not giving up on our marriage. We're not giving up on him, but you have got to find yourself again.
Yep.
You've got to find your identity, your calling, your purpose, and make sure you are connected in your Christ identity, because we don't know the outcome of this marriage. We don't know if he will participate or not in
Right.
getting help. So you have to decide, first of all, I've got to get healthy, and I've got to make sure I am in tune to Jesus, because I might have some important decisions to make, and you're going to need discernment. So through that, and in a wise set of counselors. And then two, sometimes I advise an in-home separation. If it's daily in and out of emotional and verbal abuse, and there's space to have separate bedrooms, sometimes that might have to be what happens, because trust and safety, before you can even work on a relationship, you've got to have trust and safety. And if every day you are getting verbal abuse or verbal vitriol, or it's not safe, and like many of the women that I work with have autoimmune issues, stress related issues, GI issues, their physical health is terrible, and it's all stress related. So you've got to get that stress down and put some boundaries, in place. And a boundary is not what he's going to do. A boundary is what you're going to tolerate or no longer tolerate in your field. You can't make him do anything.
Yes.
And then as you move forward, the person has to be willing to be evaluated, accept that evaluation and diagnosis, and then make sure they're working with someone who's trained in that area. But absolutely, I help people see there's autism and neurology, which is something that you're wired with, but then there's character.
Yes.
And that comes to motivation, willingness. It's one thing to be ignorant that you're hurting someone, but now when that is brought into light and I'm being told I'm hurting someone, it is now an act of my will and my character, how I will move forward. Will I stay in denial and dismiss that and say, well, you're just too sensitive, you go to therapy and work on you, I'm fine? That's a character problem. Someone who's drawing near, who's wanting to be like Christ themselves, will be interested in some feedback on how they can stop hurting their wife and children.
Yeah. I think the last 2 or 3 minutes is probably the most valuable of all. And if you are listening or watching, and this is tweaking your interest, replay the last 2 or 3 minutes, because that is so important. Just because your spouse is on the spectrum doesn't mean you don't have agency. If you are the one who is feeling harmed, you have agency, you have choices. You can take responsibility to become whole. And you've referenced something a couple times that I believe you would fully believe, but I just want to park on it for a second. For it, if my spouse is on the autism spectrum and withdraws, and I need connection, I then am responsible to look for healthy places for not sexual connection, but emotional heart connection outside the marriage. That may be even more important if I am struggling in my relationship right now. Does that resonate?
Yes. One of my favorite authors right now that I've read just about everything he's written is Dr. James Wilder. And he talks about in one of his books called The Other Half of Church, our brain runs on joy. We must have joy. And in many marriages, it might be low joy, high conflict. And so your brain to function, for you to remain functional, you must be getting joy in a relationship with other people. And joy cannot be done alone. So joy and happy are two different things. I can be happy in a hobby, but according to the neuroscience, there's a part of our brain called the orbital prefrontal cortex that receives joy, and we receive it through our right eye, and it's directly located behind our eye. And essentially, joy is someone is happy to see me, and someone is happy to be with me. So this might be a really important time, again, within your covenant marriage, and not seeking, like you said, things outside of marriage, but
Yeah.
relationships,
Yes.
community, coffee with a friend. It is really, really important for you to have that joy. The second thing Dr. Wilder would say we need is hesed. And hesed in the New Testament is agape, but it's even more than that. In the Old Testament, it's more than that. It's the scripture that says, "May the Lord shine His face upon you."
Yes.
That shine your face upon you, attachment. We need attachment. We're made for attachment. And sometimes our spouse is not that person. They're not for us. They're for themselves, especially when they're locked in that selfish self-perception of autism, and they're not willing to look outside of that. So I need people in my life that are for me, who are going to pray for me, be with me,
Yeah.
that my my well-being and good is in their heart. Then the third thing we need, he would say, is community. We have to be in community, healthy community, for the purpose of calling us back to our right self, he would say. So when I'm dysregulated and when I need good counsel, I need a Christian, I need someone to remind me, what's my Christ identity?
Yeah.
Even as Leslie Vernick would say, how do I act right when my spouse is acting wrong? Call me back to my true identity. Call me back to my joyful identity. That's how people can survive these marriages, if the person is not willing. Now, if the person's willing, you can have a difficult but amazing marriage. It's more difficult and it's more challenging, but difficult doesn't mean bad. It just means more challenging. But if the person does not want to do their work, you've really got to be responsible for your mental health, your emotional health, your spiritual health, because
Yeah.
you will need it to be in this complicated marriage.
Yeah. I'm glad you've said in a couple different ways through this conversation that we are not assuming the outcome of the marriage. That if your spouse is neurodiverse or on the spectrum, you have to become whole so that you can understand and decide what you're going to do next. But you've also hinted that there are some of these marriages that can become functional. So I just, one of the last questions here for somebody who is on the spectrum and who is interested in becoming Christ-like. I'm kind of guessing that there is some hope. You've kind of alluded to that they can become more whole and more relational. I'm sure it's not easy, but you're kind of assuming that that's the case. And I just wanted to give you a moment to comment on that.
Absolutely. So when people say, like, well, what are the steps? How do you know if a marriage might make it? First of all, is that both spouses must understand and agree that we're on the spectrum or a neurodiverse couple. And there's got to be education about that, because sometimes even wives, after we get the label and the diagnosis, like, okay, he knows he's on the spectrum. Tomorrow I expect new behavior. And I'm like, this is a brain neurology issue. This is
Yep.
not a behavior disorder. So there's going to be some time of learning new skills, both of you. You've been in years, decades of bad cycles. We had to stop some bad cycles and learn some new skills. And so if the person on the spectrum, I tell them there's two levels of acceptance. One is, okay, the criteria fit. I guess I'm on the spectrum. The second level of acceptance is really what's needed in therapy. And that's, if I'm on the spectrum, which means there's some self-referencing issues, I'm lacking or challenged in theory of mind, meaning empathy, compassion, being able to see your point of view, I'm going to have to really lean into receiving feedback. And
Yeah.
feedback is very triggering for people on the spectrum. So that's your kind of personal work to do. And I had a client one time tell me, he said, well, I'm on the spectrum, so my wife is just going to have to deal. And I think the Holy Spirit gave me the words. And I said, as long as you are a Christ follower and every day you are seeking to be more like Christ and how to have the fruit of the Spirit in you, you should be becoming more like Christ. And by definition, your neurology is the same, but your behavior should be different. If you're spending time with Jesus, you should be becoming more like him. And that is completely on you. And so there are things that can change, which is becoming more relational. That's why I'm so fascinated with Dr. Wilder's work,
Yeah.
because the orbital prefrontal cortex, which is affected in the autism spectrum, is a part of the brain that can grow and change and neuroplastic as long as a person's alive. And so learning relational skills, learning to build joy is something that can happen for any person of any neurology, except for people who maybe have traumatic brain injury and there actually is a structural damage. That's a different thing. But in autism, it's not a structured damage. It is kind of like an atrophy or failure to develop, but it can develop if you are being intentional about it. So that's the intentionality. But if there's defensiveness, dismissing, she's just too sensitive, you go work on you, you might be trying to figure out just how to survive the marriage. And 56%, and according to my survey, only 56% of couples who were staying together were able to do so in the same house. So some people who are trying to stay together might be doing it in two different homes because maybe all he can handle is nighttime dinner and weekends. Maybe that's all he can have. And maybe that's an accommodation that you have to be willing to make. And then Christian leaders, keep your nose out of it, mind your own business. Because if two people are trying to stay together and being in two different rooms or two different parts of the house or two different houses is how they are making it work because they believe they need to, honor their covenant, but the sensory stimulation is just too difficult, do not shame them for that. That is two people being very courageous and trying very hard to keep their covenant. It just may not look like a traditional couple, but they're not a traditional couple. There are so many different nuances at stake here because sometimes a child on the spectrum and an adult on the spectrum might be in the same house and they are triggering each other, and it's not good for either party. So there's still a lot more to do. We're working on a book as right now that we hope to come out in June that really talks about neurodiverse marriage and issues in social communication and executive function. What's neurology? What can change? What's accommodations versus what's abuse? And so hopefully by June, that book is out for coaches and counselors and couples to get a hold of.
Oh, powerful stuff. And I am so glad you were working on that book. You have ChristianNeurodiverseMarriage.com site with a bunch of stuff. Would that be the best place for people to find some help through your work? This is so important.
Yeah. So I'm an ordained minister. So there's a minister side of me, but then I'm also a counselor coach and I've got a living to make. So we kind of have some things on there that are free for you that if you're like, my husband's not into this, or my spouse isn't into this, or we're in a critical state. So there's a podcast with 147 different episodes for you. There's some free group coaching courses that if you want to do independently, like coming out of enemy mode, how to receive feedback. It's kind of like there's a video and you're going to like do it yourself. Then there's some paid courses like, okay, my husband will watch a course and he'll learn about this. And then there's working up to either one-on-one coaching or groups. But we wanted to provide something for everybody. We have a lot of people in ministry or missions and military who are abroad and they don't even have access to any form of counseling or coaching. And so we found that some of these resources are the only way, I call it the M's, are really getting some kind of help with their marriage. And then coaching is expensive. That is sadly what it is. That's why I would love for more LPCs to become more neurodiversity trained so that people can use their insurance. But sadly, that's just not available in many situations, states, or countries.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the work to help people wrestle with these kinds of things. I so appreciate also your distinction that regardless of your neurology, we are all still called to become more like Christ, regardless of where we start. I just want to second to Dr. James Wilder. I've read a lot of his work and really, really good stuff. Really, really good stuff.
I love it. It's so hope-filling. It's so empowering, and that we don't have to feel trapped. There are things that we can do. That's my favorite part. And it's neuroscience-based and not just opinion-based. So I love that.
Yes. Well, Dr. Holmes, this has been so good. Thank you so much for being with us on this program, and many blessings to you, your family, and your work in ministry.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Oh, wow. Wasn't that fascinating? I know that there are some of you watching who are probably saying, oh, that's going on in my marriage, and you want to find out more. ChristianNeurodiverseMarriage.com will have the link under this video. Check that out. We also have a few other links to Dr. Holmes' places where you can find her. But here's the point. Just knowing that your spouse or perhaps you are neurodiverse in some way, autism or on the spectrum. It doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it's important to take this into account as you seek to follow Jesus in your relationships. You need support. If you are the one who's feeling this from your spouse, you absolutely need support. Connect with others in the body of Christ. If you can get some professional help, I think this is certainly a time when that is important. So check that out. And I want to remind you also of my recently released book, Sexpectations, Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. This is not a book about how to have a better sex life. This is a book about dealing with the matters of the heart underneath the just surface issues around sex and sexuality and intimacy and relationships. What has been your story? Good, bad, and maybe very, very bad. And how do you invite Jesus into the middle of your story so that in the area of your sexuality and intimacy needs, you can become more whole? That absolutely impacts your relationships as well. But bringing Jesus into the middle of your sexual story is what this book is about, Sexpectations. You can find out more at yoursexpectations.com. The book is there and a number of related resources as well, some free and some little deeper for a cost. Thank you for joining me on this important conversation. I hope you're subscribed. Tell somebody about our channel or about this episode. That would be so helpful. And if you want to leave me a message, I'd love to hear from you. You can comment under this video. You can also come to our website and use the contact page there to send me a confidential message. May God bless you.